These are the numbers. These countries generate around 40% of the world's entire economy. About 48% of the planet's population lives there. Their average GDP growth in 2024 is about 4% a year. For comparison, developed economies like the US and the EU are at 1.7. They produce 42% of the world's wheat and 52% of its rice, pump out a third of oil, and mine nearly 80% of the coal. And here's the forecast. By 2030, they will account for 63% of global GDP, and by mid-century, their combined output may be 1.5 times larger than the G7's. Their populations are already growing faster than the global average. In fact, a huge share of the next generation will literally be born there. All of this is about the BRICS countries, a new economic bloc that's getting bigger by day. And not just that. More and more, it is positioning itself against the West. And that's concerning. Some might say, well, what's the big deal? The world is already full of trade alliances. There's the European Union, a lineup of countries from Portugal all the way to Finland. There's NAFTA in North America, bringing together the US, Canada, and Mexico. There's ASEAN in Southeast Asia, stretching from Indonesia and Malaysia to Vietnam and Thailand. All of them want the same thing: transparent borders, cheaper goods, and freer movement of capital. And if another trade bloc pops up, great. Even smoother trade, even more affordable products. So where's the problem? The problem is that BRICS is aiming much higher than a typical trade alliance. Its goal is to split the world into two economic camps. It's literally about a new global war. Hopefully, this one will stay cold, and the bloc's members barely try to hide their plan. There's no official name for it yet, but if I had to invent one, I'd call it Project Azios. 2009, Yekaterinburg, Russia. A new bloc is announced. Back then it's still just BRIC: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. A year later, South Africa joins, and the acronym becomes the familiar BRICS. And then things really start picking up. On January 1st, 2024, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE become members. In January 2025, Indonesia officially joins the club. That same year, Saudi Arabia gets an invitation. Algeria applied back in 2022 and now holds partner status. Pakistan is interested in joining. So this is what BRICS looks like on the map. And you can see why that picture makes a lot of people uneasy, right? Because what we're looking at is a self-contained trading system. Think about it. At one end, you've got China, the world's factory. It ships out everything, from cheap kids' toys and holiday lights to smartphones, electric cars, and industrial machinery. Your Nokia phone, your jeans, even that fancy Chanel bag of yours were very likely made in China. India is catching up fast as an exporter. And while China buys steel in massive quantities to feed its endless construction projects, India does the opposite. It ships steel out, and the volumes grow every year. But to export finished goods, you first need the raw materials to make them, which means that the same China and India need to import resources. From where? Exactly. From other BRICS countries. Brazil brings in soy, which goes straight into livestock feed. Russia adds oil and gas, keeping the whole system energy secure. And if something goes wrong, Saudi Arabia is a backup. BRICS won't be left without oil. Finally, South Africa supplies coal, which still powers a huge share of energy systems in developing nations. Of course, it's not a fully closed system yet. BRICS still has strong links to the West. For example, India imports large volumes of iron ore and gas from Australia, and Brazil remains an important trade partner for the US. But these channels could, in principle, be cut. Would the BRICS structure fall apart? Unlikely. It's self-sufficient. China and India are enormous global factories. Brazil, Russia, and South Africa are essentially giant warehouses. And together, they can fully supply each other. But between a warehouse and a factory, you also need a conveyor belt. And that is exactly what the bloc is building. Just trace the latest expansions of BRICS. Malaysia and Indonesia control the Strait of Malacca, through which the lion's share of China's cargo flows. Egypt and Ethiopia give the bloc influence over the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. Turkey, Nepal, and Kazakhstan sit along the route of the old Silk Road, the overland link from Asia to Europe. South Africa already holds a strategic position at the southern tip of Africa. Algeria is becoming a major transit point in the central Mediterranean. And all of these countries are either BRICS members, partners or eager to join. Put them together, and you get a massive logistics corridor stretching across the planet. Oh, and by the way, it runs right past the Western world. But of course, this giant transport corridor isn't really controlled by force yet, and that matters. Right now, BRICS is a very loose structure. The bloc has no single government, no executive bodies. Basically, BRICS is just a venue for summits and joint statements that don't legally bind anyone to anything. No one's even talking about a shared army or collective defense. At first glance, it's a harmless talk club. But there's one serious catch. It's the new development bank, which the BRICS countries set up as their own version of the World Bank. Its capital is $100 billion. Looks modest at first. The World Bank, IBRD, has over $320 billion in subscribed capital, but only about $22 billion of that is actually paid in. The rest is just guarantees on paper. So the real gap isn't that big. What is this bank supposed to do? Officially, lend to BRICS members, give loans for infrastructure and environmental projects. But here's the ace up its sleeve. More and more often, people are talking about a single BRICS currency that would replace the US dollar. And it's this joint bank that would be the one to issue it. If they pull that off, BRICS will be able to do what these two never managed. These two are Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi. What do they have in common? Well, both were horrible dictators. Each dragged his country into insane wars. Saddam's Iraq into an 8-year meat grinder with Iran, then into the invasion of Kuwait, and in the end, a clash with a US-led coalition. Gaddafi's Libya was dragged into a string of conflicts in Africa, which led to a civil war, which led, again, to NATO intervention. And both ended the same way. They lost power and were killed. But there's one more important thing they had in common. At some point, both Hussein and Gaddafi suggested selling their oil not for dollars, but for other currencies. What's so wrong with that, you might ask? It's not like they planned to rob anyone. They were basically saying, we want fair payment for our oil, just not in dollars. So there is no real problem, right? No, there is indeed a problem. You see, every time India, for example, buys oil from Saudi Arabia in dollars, the US makes money on that. The mechanism is simple. Everyone needs dollars. Most international payments still go through that currency. And even if you don't need to spend the money right away, it's still safer to keep your reserves in super liquid dollars. Picture this. Your country needs to buy modern fighter jets, say the EA-18G Growler. If you're holding dollars, no problem, the US will sell you the planes. But if you're holding euros, that won't fly. European countries just don't make that kind of aircraft. So, with almost any other currency, you risk getting stuck. And who wants that? That's why the central banks of almost every country keep most of their reserves in dollars. China's reserves, for example, are about 55% dollars. France and Japan, roughly 70%. But those dollars can't just sit there. They're pushed back into the US economy by buying American Treasury bonds, which creates a closed loop. The larger the global economy grows, the greater the demand for US bonds. And America can borrow from the entire world almost without limit. And not just borrow, but borrow cheaply. The logic is simple. The higher the price of a bond, the less it costs the US to service it. Imagine a bond that costs $100 and pays a fixed coupon of $5. That's a 5% annual yield. But if demand pushes the bond's price up to $200, the coupon stays the same, $5. That means the actual yield for the buyer drops to 2.5%, which means, in turn, that the US effectively pays half as much on that debt. In the end, America borrows money more cheaply than anyone else. That makes building businesses and maintaining a military cheaper too. Economists call this the exorbitant privilege. And the discount the US gets on borrowing isn't symbolic. It's about 1 percentage point. Sounds small, but let's compare. Today's governments typically borrow at around 4%. It means the US gets money for about a quarter less than everyone else. That's big. And here's another thing. The usual economic rule. The more money circulates inside a country, the higher the inflation. Doesn't apply to the US either, because America can export its inflation. Here's how that works. In many countries, the dollar is used instead of local money. Classic example, Russia in the 1990s, after the collapse of the USSR. The ruble was worthless. Cars and apartments were priced in hard currency, dollars. So, the US can print new dollars, use them to buy oil, and those dollars will then stay circulating in the Russian economy, driving inflation there. It's almost like magic. America prints paper, sends it out into the world, and gets real goods in return. That's what a country earns from issuing the currency everyone uses. Economists call it seigniorage, and the US is really riding that wealth train. If you're wondering how the world got into this situation in the first place, here's the 2-minute version. After World War II, Europe was in ruins, and gold reserves were draining into one safe place, the United States. So, after the war, the world agreed that the dollar would become the main international currency. Well, the world had no choice, really. Only America could support this new currency with massive gold reserves. The agreement was called Bretton Woods, after the American town where it was signed. And that's how the US became the world's financial treasurer. But after the war, the global economy started reviving. Production grew, trade expanded, and more money entered circulation. But gold reserves, the foundation of the whole system, stayed fixed. It soon became clear the US couldn't keep the huge volume of dollars tied to gold forever. The choice was brutal. Either abandon the dollar as the world's reserve currency or abandon the gold peg. President Richard Nixon chose the second option, and in 1971, he stunned the world. He announced that from that moment on, the US would no longer exchange dollars for gold. What's that? We promised something to someone? Well, we don't recall that. Over a night, the US dollar became a piece of paper. So why didn't it collapse? Think of the old saying, if you owe the bank $1 million, that's your problem. If you owe $1 billion, that's the bank's problem. By 1971, America's debt had become everyone's problem. Every central bank held reserves in dollars. A dollar crash would have taken down the entire global economy. So everyone chose to play along. But Nixon didn't stop there. 3 years later, he made another bold move. In 1974, the US struck a deal with Saudi Arabia. The kingdom would sell all its oil only for dollars, and in return, it would get American military protection. From that moment on, any country wanting to buy oil first had to buy dollars. Suddenly, the entire world became dependent on the Federal Reserve. If the dollar ever sank sharply, oil prices would skyrocket, and the world would plunge into hyperinflation. So ever since, the US has effectively been able to borrow endlessly from the rest of the planet. And the planet is grateful, because the US dollar is a lubricant of the global economy. If you yank it out of the system, the whole machine will grind to a halt. Though some people see this as a ticking time bomb. Back in the late 1960s, Robert Triffin described what became known as the Triffin dilemma. To supply the world with dollars, America has to keep expanding its debt. But the bigger the debt, the heavier the burden on its own economy. Interest payments pile up, even if the rates are low. It's a no-win situation. If the US stops borrowing, the world economy collapses. If it keeps borrowing, its own budget eventually cracks. A system destined, sooner or later, to self-destruct. But that's in theory. And what about in practice? In practice, the US is still here, still strong, and keeps borrowing like there is no tomorrow. In 1980, the national debt was under $1 trillion. By 2000, about $5.5 trillion. By 2020, $26 trillion. And already by 2025, $38 trillion. And it seems like there are no plans to stop. But the real question is, what if someone forces the US to stop? Imagine BRICS really does create its own reserve currency, as let's call it the ASEUS. The world economy splits in two, and in one half, the dollar is no longer needed. That means demand for US government bonds drops by about half, which in turn means US debt becomes twice as expensive to service. And at the same time, seigniorage revenue going into the American budget gets cut in half. Not exactly a dream scenario. But again, that's all theory. In practice, BRICS is still a club of countries that are constantly on the brink of fighting each other. Take India and China. In 1962, Chinese troops attacked Indian positions in Ladakh in the Aksai Chin region. Since then, China has held the area and isn't about to give it up. All because a strategically important road to Tibet runs through there. And Tibet is where the big rivers that supply India with water begin. Beijing hints. If they build a chain of power plants on those rivers, they could cut half the country off from water. India is Well, not thrilled by that prospect. Iran and Saudi Arabia don't get along much either. The Saudi leadership sees Iran's rulers as crazed fanatics, while Tehran looks at the Saudi princes as sellouts who bent the knee to the US. And then there's India's long-standing territorial dispute with Pakistan. The latest flare-up was in April 2025, a major air battle with downed fighter jets. And of course, both countries have nuclear weapons. When you look at this whole mess, the idea of launching a shared currency starts to sound absurd. You might say, okay, but business heals all wounds. The problem is, even good business isn't likely to happen. BRICS countries have opposite economic interests. Brazil and Russia are classic commodity exporters. They benefit from a weak currency. When the exchange rate drops, every dollar they earn from selling oil, gas, or soy brings in more local money into the budget. China and India, by contrast, have more mixed economies. They export a lot, but they also import a lot. Equipment, technology, components. They'd rather have a stronger currency. The stronger it is, the cheaper the imports. Two opposite logics inside one block. So, the question becomes, who exactly is going to set the exchange rate for this common currency if it ever appears at all? Most likely, the exchange rate would have to be set by some kind of joint council, and that automatically means that all the BRICS countries would have to bail out each other, the same way the European Union did during its debt meltdown. Remember Greece in the early 2000s? The country piled up massive government debt and was prepared to declare bankruptcy. But the EU stepped in with new loans. Germany paid the most. In effect, they rescued the weakest link to keep the common currency from collapsing. So, how would that work in BRICS? Let's say Brazil falls into a crisis. Normally, the country could weaken its currency to make exports cheaper or print a bit of money to patch a budget hole. But with a shared currency, neither option is possible. That means the bailout has to be collective. China, India, and Russia would all have to chip in to solve Brazil's problems. Will they want to? So, for now, a BRICS currency and the scenario of crashing Western economies look more like a clickbait. On the other hand, history has a habit of putting analytics to shame. In the early 20th century, nobody in their right mind believed the world's great powers would launch a total war, because that would be madness, suicide. And yet, they did. And in the late 1980s, almost no one in the US thought the Soviet Union could collapse in just 2 or 3 years. From the outside, the system looks solid. BRICS is the same. 30 years ago, no one even took the idea of such a bloc seriously, which is exactly why it's worth keeping an eye on. Speaking of history being weird, great case in point is South Africa, the member of BRICS that usually gets the least attention, which is a shame. The country had concentration camps that unexpectedly held white people. Also, it's the only country in history to voluntarily give up nuclear weapons. If you're curious, we have a full video about it. Give it a watch, you'll enjoy it.